Good evening, everybody. This is William Dyer, and this is Dyer Conversations. Today, we are here with our friend and our guest, returning Mr. Archaeologist Ted Wright. Ted, thanks for showing up on the show today, man.
Hey, Billy, great to be with you again, brother.
Yeah. Well, today we're here to tell ghost stories. So now I saw how this podcast got kickstarted was I saw that you posted a book about the first ghost. And I was
Yes.
like, well, first of all, that's super interesting because I love ghost stuff. I love talking about the spiritual realm and all that sort of weird things. But then tying it back into archaeology, I was like, well, that's interesting. I want to see how that plays out. So I guess that's my first question I have for you is, how is it as an archaeologist that you get interested in something like studying ghosts since they're not leaving artifacts behind for you to dig up in the ground? Like, how does that work out?
Hey, Billy, that's a great question. Again, thanks for having me on again, man. And this is a fascinating topic. I mean, it's obviously in the pop culture. There's all kinds of movies. People are really obsessed with the supernatural, and there's all kinds of movies about this, and podcasts and books. And another thing in our culture is people's fascination with UAPs and UFOs and things like that. But as far as ghosts, my first interest actually started quite a few years ago. I don't know if I think I may have been a seminary student, and I actually found a book by a Christian archaeologist actually that taught at Old Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary years ago. His name is Dr. Merrill Unger, Unger. And the title of the book I believe it was called Demonology, and that was the title of the book, Demonology, and it was a history of demons in the Bible. And I think you can still get copies of it. But what fascinated me about the book, Billy, is that when I opened it up and started looking through it, it had a ton of archaeology in it, and there was a lot of archaeological things that he was citing in the book in relationship to demons in the Old Testament and the ancient world. And then recently, so that got me started on the being interested in the topic of demons and ghosts and the afterlife in the ancient world. And then several years ago, I was introduced to the work of a British Assyriologist at the British Museum named Dr. Irving Finkel. And when I started really reading Finkel was really in my interest in my research of the whole Noah's Ark story and the historical artifacts and geography associated with the landing of the Ark. He actually wrote a book called The Ark Before Noah, and so I had that book, and then I saw that he wrote another book on ghosts, and so knowing Dr. Finkel's excellent scholarship, I thought this has got to be a great book, and it really, really is. And a book about ghosts. And so the question is, how in the world? And this is the question that I had too. Is when I first saw Finkel's book on it, I thought, well, I wonder how he's going to do this, because there's a lot of there are some historical inscriptions about demons and stuff, but how do you study ghosts through archaeology? Well, as it turns out, you can't study the afterlife or the supernatural through artifacts, because archaeology is a study of artifacts. It's a study of things that people leave behind. So pottery, buildings like that. But there are historical inscriptions, and there are statues and certain things that people have made that help us to understand what people believed about the supernatural world. So these things do point to a very strong belief in the spiritual world from humans at the very, very earliest beginning of time. In fact, in his book, Finkel says that we can actually point to the very first word for ghost on a clay tablet, a cuneiform tablet, from near the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, some about 5,000 years ago. There was the Sumerian word for ghost. And then in the beginning of the book, he also sort of lays out archaeologically what we can infer through the archaeology of people, of the earliest humans, at least that we find in the archaeological record, and their belief in some sort of afterlife, which is interesting, and we can unpack this here in a minute. But let me just list a few here, Billy. One of the earliest, and this is debated among Christians. Christian scholars debate this, but I'm just going to throw it out there. So the question is whether or not Neanderthals were actually related to humans. And I think one of the things that hinges on that is, do we find human culture in Neanderthal archaeology. In fact, there was a cave in northern Iraq in a place called, we call it sort of in the regional areas called Iraqi Kurdistan. And this place is called Shanidar Cave. And there, several years ago, there was discovered a Neanderthal burial there, and it looked like there were flowers in the grave with the Neanderthals. And that the significance of that is that it looked like the Neanderthals were putting flowers on the grave deliberately. Now the debate is in sort of the controversy, not the controversy, but you got two people on either side, that the flowers actually, or the pollen actually came in through a burial of or a boring of a rodent later. And then some people still think that no, Neanderthals were actually putting flowers on graves. But then later, we'll say that there were discovered other Neanderthal burials that were deliberate, which seems to indicate in the very, very earliest human levels, humans believed in some sort of afterlife, or at least they had a respect for the dead. And then, even if you don't take the Neanderthal as being evidence of belief in the afterlife, in the Upper Paleolithic, this is a time period that Finkel talks about as well. He kind of goes over this in the beginning of the book. So just for people's understanding of the Paleolithic is about, again, I don't want to debate age of the earth and all that, but according to traditional dating that archaeologists give, the Upper Paleolithic dates to around 50,000 years ago, show that grave goods in burials were actually really commonplace. So again, no matter what date you put on the Upper Paleolithic, it shows that the very earliest humans are actually burying people, they're dead, with grave goods, and indicating that there's some sort of at least belief in the afterlife. And then, of course, we get into the historical period, and one of the earliest myths in Mesopotamia is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And people may or may not be familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, but to make a long story short, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, and he becomes friends with this sort of crazy wild man named Enkidu. That's his name, Enkidu, spelled with an E, Enkidu. And Enkidu is actually killed in the city of Uruk. There is this bull that was created by the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, because Gilgamesh refused to go with Ishtar. So she was a spurned lover. So she sent the bull of heaven down to Uruk to fight Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So Enkidu's killed, and what's interesting about the Epic of Gilgamesh, Billy, is that people read that story in grade school, but it actually contains some really profound philosophical questions. And this is the very earliest historical things that we have. And when Enkidu dies, when he's killed by the bull of heaven, Gilgamesh completely has a 180. Before Enkidu's death, he's this crazy madman. He's killing everybody and taking everybody's wife, literally. And then after the death of Enkidu, he gets very contemplative, and he begins to think about the afterlife, and and the question that burns in Gilgamesh's mind is, can a man live forever, or are we just mortal? And so then Gilgamesh goes on this journey. Get this, he goes on a journey because he remembers that there is a man who's still alive. He was alive before the flood. In fact, he survived the flood, and his name was Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. Now, we know the same story in the Bible in Genesis 6 through 10, or Genesis 6 through 9, of the flood narrative, and that's Noah. It's the same exact character. So Gilgamesh goes to this far-off mountain, and he meets with Utnapishtim, because he's trying to figure out, can he live forever? And Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that there is a plant, get this, that if you eat this plant, it's called the plant of the Shabti, I think it's spelled Shabti. It's a Sumerian word, and it means plant of the heartbeat. So that sounds very familiar to the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good, or the tree of life, rather, in the Garden of Eden. So Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about this plant, and he tells him where to get it. And incidentally, the plant is in the bottom of the ocean, so Gilgamesh has to put bricks on his feet and go dive down to the bottom of the ocean to get it, because obviously it was lost in the flood. So Gilgamesh gets the plant, he brings it back on the surface, and then a sea snake takes the plant back down on the bottom of the ocean. So he can't live forever; he's going to
Gotta watch
die.
them sea snakes,
So that's
man.
a I know, you gotta watch out for the sea snake. So that's a whole long story of how this very complex understanding of death. And then another myth that came up, this is a very early myth in Mesopotamia, is there's a Mesopotamian goddess by the name of Inanna. She's also known as Ishtar. She is the goddess of war and love, and she descends into the underworld. And then, of course, many people are familiar with ancient Egypt and the Egyptian concept of the afterlife. And one of the most important myths in Egypt is called the myth of Osiris. And the myth of Osiris, basically, that myth, and this is in the book, The First Ghost. He gets into this a little bit. Finkel does, although not. He doesn't develop it as much. He mainly focuses his attention on Mesopotamia. But I think it's good to bring up the myth of Osiris, because in the myth of Osiris in ancient Egypt, Osiris, of course, is this great king, and he has a brother named Seth, who actually is very jealous of him. He murders his brother and chops his body up and cuts his body up and spreads it all around the earth. Osiris's wife, Isis, actually, because she knows magic, she actually collects the body parts and she patches them back together with linen cloths. So what does that sound like? It sounds like mummification. And in fact, that's exactly. So she puts with her magic, she brings Osiris back from the dead, and of course, they have a son named Horus, and everybody knows who Horus is. He's the falcon headed god, and he is the god of kingship. So, Osiris, now that he's put back together as a mummy, he can actually, if he wanted to, in fact, he was offered to come back and rule. On earth as the Pharaoh of Egypt, but he says no. I'm gonna rule in the afterlife, and I'm gonna be the main god in the underworld, and my son is going to be the ruler of all the kings of Egypt. So that's why Horus is considered to be connected with kingship and the Pharaoh in the Egyptian pantheon. And then, of course, since we're talking about the Old Testament, and we're talking about this very ancient, very early concept of the afterlife and things like this, in the book of Job, Job asks the question, when a man dies, shall he live again? And so, what there seems to be, I think, Billy, is in these early Mesopotamian myths, and even in the book of Job, which is a very early book in the Old Testament, historically speaking, is that humans are haunted by the consequences and the results of the fall, and they long for eternal life. There's this burden of mortality. And so this is this whole idea of the longing for the eternal, and of course, as the writer of Ecclesiastes says, that God has planted eternity in the hearts of man. So those are a few things here as we sort of kind of open up the the discussion about the afterlife, and I haven't really gotten into ghosts yet, but maybe we can do that next.
So, all right, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So I know you're an outdoors guy. I don't know if you like hunt or anything like that, but have you ever gone like to a place where you're like deep in the woods? I mean, you're like, I'm away from civilization. I haven't seen anybody. Maybe I've gone on like a 3-day hiking, camping trip or whatever. And you get out there and it's dark. Or like I haven't seen, I've gone hiking before. I've camped for a couple of days and I'm just off in like some random, massive state park. And I haven't seen a human for, a couple of days or whatnot. And all of a sudden you start hearing those noises in the middle of the woods, right? So I think to myself, like, what would it have been like to have been like Cain, or one of those early guys, there's a 300 people population on the face of the earth. And all of a sudden, you're going to, I'm the Western frontier guy. I'm going to go out and try to explore. But then all of a sudden, some creepy things started happening. Stuff like that had to happen back in the day.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt. Yeah, people were, in the ancient world, that's the interesting thing about this book is that, surprisingly, Finkel, I don't know what his religious convictions are, but I think he grew up Jewish, and I think he's sort of agnostic slash atheist now. But he's open. He says that for the majority of human history, people have believed in the supernatural. They believed in that there's the supernatural world, and since the Enlightenment, we have sort of cast that out. Now, some scholars are talking about, re-enchanting of the world. But you're absolutely right. In the ancient world, there certainly would see things and hear things, that cause them to believe that maybe there's something, maybe they're not alone. In fact, that's one of the things that Finkel says in the book is that from the very earliest dawn of humanity in the historical record, there was a belief in the supernatural. The supernatural was very much a part of the worldview of ancient people, and it was just part of what they lived with, and they dealt with this on a daily basis. And of course, they didn't live as long as we did because, of course, their health and was connected to their diet, and just the living conditions back then were not like they were before the flood. So, what's interesting is that in Genesis, um, one of the interesting biblical connections with death is actually all the way back in Genesis 5. You may remember that, Billy, in Genesis 5. This is the genealogy of Noah. This is the generations of Noah, or generations of Adam, rather. This is the account of Adam. And I don't want to get into all the details of this, and there's a lot we could say about it, but I just want to point out a couple of things about the interesting things, patterns that I want people to understand. And Genesis 5, of course, pardon me, um, all the way back in Genesis 3, when God, declares the judgment on the serpent, the woman, and the man, and he's going to die, Adam. The death is introduced to the world because of Adam's sin, and the ground was cursed. And so we read on, and then we finally come to Genesis 5, and then this is the genealogy, or this is the generations of Adam. And the phrase "and they died," it says so and so begat so and so, and they died, and they died, and they died. And there were a couple people, well, one in particular in the Genesis 5 account. Enoch walked with God and was not. So it didn't say that he died, it just says that he was not, for God took him. Pardon me. So, and then we're introduced to Noah, who also walked with God. So, which then leads us to Genesis 6 and the events which led to the flood to destroy the entire earth. And this opens up a whole nother can of worms, but I think it is connected to our biblical understanding of demons and fallen angels and their interaction with the ancient world. And of course, many people have read and are familiar with the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, who's now with the Lord. And I've read some of his stuff, watched quite a few of his podcasts, and he's a fascinating guy and has really opened up this world of the supernatural in the Old Testament. And so that's, as an Old Testament guy, it really fascinates me. But I'm also I'm in the world of ancient Mesopotamian archaeology and history as well. And Dr. Heiser is a language guy, and that is his strength. But there's one little thing, though, I do disagree with him on, and of course, people can argue later about that. But let me just say that the key passage here is the Genesis 6 passage that was the onset of the flood. It says the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives for themselves. And of course, the identification, one of the big questions is who were the sons of God and who were the daughters of men. And of course, there's two different views on this. And of course, the understanding is, at least when you read the text in Genesis 6, that there was some sort of union between the sons of gods and daughters of men that was not good, because the offspring from these sons of God and daughters of men were Nephilim, or giants. And so either they are physical offspring between fallen angels or demons and humans, or they are the physical offspring of pagan men and our pagan daughters, and the godly line of coming from Seth. So I'll just go ahead and tell you, I take the view that these are not fallen angels having intercourse with humans. Um, there's actually some metaphysical problems with that, and I know that's probably a whole other podcast. But I think from an ancient Near Eastern archaeology perspective, I think we can look at this term giant. It's translated as giant, um, but it can be translated any number of ways. So the key thing though is how it would have been understood for a person living in the ancient Near East. Now remember, we're talking here, even though the writer of Genesis is Moses, he's referring to a time before the flood, and so we're talking about a very, very ancient time frame here. And so how did people in the ancient world understand what a giant was? And so, or a big man or a great man. So it's prehistoric. And so also one of the thing to add to this is that writing is not invented. Writing, as we know it, is not invented until about the 4th millennium BC. So we're talking about 3400 BC at a city called Uruk. And writing starts out pictographically, and then it's counting, and then eventually we see some myth of Atrahasis, and then we see the Epic of Gilgamesh come forth. But in some of the earliest writings that we have, the Hebrew word, of course, for king is the word melech, and that word is not used. But there is a Sumerian equivalent of giant or great man, and that is the Sumerian word lugal, or it means big man or great king. So from an archaeological context, I think the best understanding of giants is not literal, like gigantic people or creatures, by the way, that we have never found archaeologically. And we've been excavating in Mesopotamia for well over 100 years. And to date, no one has ever found a giant. Despite what you see on the internet, giant bones have not been discovered. So what I think this is, we're prideful, arrogant men who are very likely either demon possessed or demon influenced. Now, interestingly, as we continue to read on after the flood in Genesis 10, Nimrod is called in the translation is a man of renown. And so again, another subject that I'm sure will generate some debate, and that is the identification of Nimrod, who I identify, and not just me, but I've got several colleagues, historical and archaeological colleagues, who hold to this as well. I believe that Nimrod was a known king named by the name of Sargon of Akkad. And Sargon united Akkadian and Sumerian speaking people groups in Mesopotamia into the first empire of the world. He was the first empire builder in world history. And guess what he's called? He's called a great man, a giant. And he did it. In fact, the Bible says he was a great hunter. And when you think of Nimrod being a great hunter, you think, well, maybe he hunted lions or whatever. And now one of my colleagues, Dr. Douglas Petrovich, actually wrote a book on this. And what Petrovich argues in the book, based even on inscriptional evidence, is that that Sargon of Akkad, the reference to Nimrod being a hunter is not talking necessarily about hunting animals, although it can include that, but hunting men. He was a great hunter of men. And this is actually in an inscription by one of the first. Actually, it's the earliest known war monument to exist. It's called the Vulture Stele, and it dates to around it's the early dynastic period, so 2600 to 2350 BC. It was excavated by a French archaeologist by the name of Ernest de Sarzac in the 1880s in a site called Girsu in southern Iraq. There were about 7 fragments of this stele that were discovered. The complete monument, as reconstructed, is now on display at the Louvre in Paris, and it's about 5 and 11 feet high and about 4 feet wide. And in any case, the stele actually shows the victory of a king by the name of Eannatum over Umma over a dispute over this tract of land between 2 city-states. and the fragment actually shows piles of dead bodies after a battle. And this is really interesting because in this description, it actually has these bodies in a net, meaning that this early king is a great man trapping human beings. In fact, there's a Danish, I think he's Danish scholar years ago named Thorkild Jacobsen, and he says about this stele, he says Mesopotamian kingship, Namlugal, that's what literally it means, originated with leadership in war. When attack threatened, a young noble was chosen pro tem to lead the community in battle and was granted supreme powers during emergency. When the gods came to be seen as rulers, it was natural that they should be expected to provide protection against outside foes. And tests from the early dynastic period show how Ningirsu does battle with Girsu's neighbor and perennial enemy, Uma. The famous stele of the vultures shows how the god has cast his net over the foes and cracks their skulls one by one with his mace, as a fowler might do to netted birds. So that's interesting. And one other quick thing about the identification of these giants, meaning the offspring, the giants, not literal giants, but depicted in a larger than life manner. Archaeologically, another thing that makes the case that they're not actual, physical giants is about, there's several actually, but I want to list about 3 or 4 here, kings that are presented, and perhaps we can show some photographs of this, as giants. One of the earliest references is a Mesopotamian king by the name of Naram Sin, and he's depicted as this giant king over his enemies. And so that is a pretty clear indication that obviously, he's not physically giant. He's just presenting himself as larger than life. And then Gilgamesh is also in the Gilgamesh epic presented as a giant or a great man. Another inscription that there's actually a bas reliefs of this is the last king of the Assyrian Empire by the name of Ashurbanipal, who is depicted as larger, physically larger than anybody else around him. And then another excellent example of this, it even goes all the way into the Egyptian kings and the pharaohs, was a pharaoh by the name of Tutmos III. Incidentally, one of the Exodus pharaohs that figures into the Exodus story, in the seventh pylon at Karnak, depicts Tutmos III as smiting his enemies, and he's giant. I mean, the picture, you can see how large he is over his enemies. So all of that to say that the purpose of this unholy interaction between the daughters of men. These were the daughters of men. These were the ungodly. These are women who were not following God, and the sons of God. The sons of God are not referring to angels. They're referring to the godly line coming from Seth. Because you remember, Billy, that the context of the Old Testament, who was it written to? It was written to the Israelites. And where were they for 400 years? They were in Egypt. And where were they about to go? They were about to go into Canaan, and God had warned them again and again not to intermarry with the Canaanites. In fact, he tells them in multiple occasions throughout the Torah, do not intermarry with the Canaanites because they're going to, in fact, don't marry their women because they're going to, in fact, it even mentions their women because it's going to lead the men astray. It has nothing to do with like racial or anything like that. It's spiritual. So don't intermarry with the Canaanites because they're going to be tempting the men to worship their God, which eventually they do, of course, under Ahaz and his wife Jezebel, who was a Canaanite, and we see what happened there, and then of course King Solomon as well. Because when you intermarry, when the Jewish people who were given the law, the Torah, intermarry with these unclean pagans that are influenced by demonic ideas, then it's going to invite judgment. So all that that's a long-winded answer or a long-winded discussion to basically say that Abraham obviously would have been familiar with many of these concepts, and Mesopotamian beliefs about spirits and demons. And then, of course, we know of Abraham eventually left Ur and migrated to Haran to the north. But also, Billy, not only would Abraham would have been familiar with Mesopotamian ideas of demons and angels in the afterlife, or not angels, but certain spiritual beings, but also we also know from the Old Testament that many Jews went into captivity in Assyria and Babylonia and Persia during the exilic period. In fact, it was likely while they were there in exile that perhaps the Jews learned about exorcism, and we see this in the New Testament period. In fact, the Second Temple period, we see this in the inscriptional evidence that there were professional Jewish exorcists, even in the time of Christ, in which they would actually cast out demons. In fact, there was a widespread belief among the Jews in ghosts as well. And in Mesopotamia, ghosts were believed to be the spirit of the departed person, and they would walk around in tombs. And so, of course, there's an episode recorded in Mark chapter 6 where you remember when Jesus was walking in the water and his disciples thought they saw a ghost. And when they saw him, walking on the boat. And then, of course, in the New Testament, Jesus cast out many demons and healed many people who were afflicted by demonic activity.
Before we get to the New Testament, I want to ask you something back in reference to the Nephilim. So, well, first you were talking about the giant men, right? And I agree with you thinking about the language and how it's used. I mean, we even use that language today, right? Like you think about somebody like a Norm Geisler, and I've heard people talk, man, that was a giant of a man.
Absolutely.
He wasn't taller than me. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's not a matter of like how tall he is. You're just saying like how important of a figure he is, how impactful of a person he is, the monumental things that they did on this earth. So I can understand that language of saying like this person is a giant of a man in reference to a great king or a great warrior or just somebody who's super influential. Okay, that's cool.
It's funny you mentioned that, Billy, because I literally just screenshotted just a couple of hours ago. It just like when I was looking over my notes tonight for tonight's podcast, I thought, ooh, I gotta share this. Now here's it on my screensaver here.
Nice.
This was just tweeted. We're recording this on the day that it was announced that there's maybe a deal with freeing the captives in Israel from Hamas. And so there was a tweet by Donald Trump, and this is literally what he says. He's actually praising the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. I'm going to read the literal quote. This is the tweet that Trump said. United States Ambassador Mike Huckabee is amazing. He's amazing. I can't do a Trump impression. He worked so hard and did so much to bring about peace in the Middle East. He is very quickly becoming a great man. And the word great man is all caps. Thank you, Mike. So I thought, isn't that interesting? We were just talking about, great men, big man. So that's the idea of it has to do with pride. And so, it's interesting that in connection with that, it's all connected. The more I teach the Old Testament, the more I see how the Old Testament, New Testament are connected, and that's not surprising. But in Matthew 24, Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. So if we want to understand what is it going to be like in the future, we need to understand what was like in the past, and what were the events that led to the flood in the Old Testament. Understanding that is key to understanding what's going to happen in the future. So if we get that wrong, then we're going to get the future wrong. That's why I think it's important to identify the results of basically compromise, spiritual compromise with demonic activity. And that is exactly, I think, what we see today happening in our world today is see pastors and ministers who are saying things that are diametrically opposed to God's word.
Yeah. And we're talking about the compromise. So that's kind of what I wanted to go back to with the Nephilim. And you're a good person to ask, so I keep wanting to go back to it. So I originally, back in the day, when I first became a Christian, I was taught by one of the guys that was kind of one of, the main teachers that I knew, that they were fallen angels. And, he referenced like, hey, the principle of first reference, right? So you go into the scriptures, you see like, where's this phrase first used? How is it used? It was used in Job. It's talking about, it seems to be clearly talking about angels, right? They were there at the dawn of time, rejoicing when God created the world. And then you get some texts in the New Testament that talk about angels not keeping their first abode and angels sinning in certain ways, like what seems to be in some sort of connection to sexual sins of humans, right? So he goes on this thing. And you're like, okay, well, I mean, that seems plausible. I believe in the supernatural. Yes, it seems weird. Like you said, a metaphysical issue of angels. So what did they do? Like, did they assume human bodies? Like, how did all that work? I don't know, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly,
But then I had a college professor make this point, and I've never been able to really track down like a source for it. But he was a historian, and he talked about that he believed, based off of ancient Near Eastern sources, that it was in reference to essentially the ancient cultures learning some sort of like genetic modification practices, essentially like breeding practices, right? Like you could breed a dog, right? You could, like, you breed certain. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our like superstar people and we're gonna breed them with other superstar people, so that way we can, keep that sort of purity or whatever, keep on producing. It's more likely that you put two tall people together, it's more likely you're going to get a tall kid. So that's what he was saying. And it didn't really catch me at the time, but then I started trying to research it later, and he had died. And I'm like, I don't have any source for this, but that seems pretty reasonable. Like, I could see that happening.
Yeah. Sort of like eugenics. Sounds like eugenics to me.
So have you ever heard anything like that?
I have never come across that at all. In the I've got a ton of stuff on ancient Near Eastern culture, and especially Mesopotamian culture. Living here in Chicago, I have access to the ISAC Museum, and which formerly Oriental Institute. Some of the top scholars in the world, Jacobson, who I quoted earlier, taught at the Oriental Institute. It was founded by James Henry Breasted. These are the guys who, just so you people know, the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, they have several dictionaries, multi-volume dictionaries that they have created. And these are not dictionaries of just like, one of them is the Assyrian dictionary of the Assyrian language that overtook almost 100 years to create. I think they may be done with it now. They also have the Hittite dictionary and the Coptic dictionary. And I have never come across anything of any kind of selective breeding or anything like that. But there is quite a lot of extensive evidence of ancient Near Eastern culture. In fact, there's another good book by another scholar called, by the name of Henry Frankfurt, called Kingship and the Gods. And there's this, what I think's going on, Billy, is that's a great, interesting theory. I've never heard that before, and I'm open to it. I just don't know. I've never read anything. I've never come across in my readings of primary sources or secondary sources of anything, any kind of selective breeding ideas. I don't know if maybe they did understand that. I never come across that in my reading of Mesopotamian literature. But in any case, what I think's going on is that we do know from historical sources very solidly, and we have extensive writings on this from the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, that the kings of these nations were intimately interconnected with their gods. In fact, they were representative of the gods on earth. So I think a case could be made that if these foreign gods from Mesopotamia, such as Marduk and Ishtar, and in Egypt, like Osiris and Amun-Ra and Isis and all these things, are actually demons behind the scenes, and that they're ruling in the place of these kings and being influenced. And sometimes the kings had to go in Egypt. There's this elaborate process, and they have these festivals. There's the Sed festival and the festival of Opet, and in which the king, there's a lot of necromancy and speaking with the dead and all kinds of things, and possibly even some hallucinogenic stuff. So I could certainly see where the demonic and the spiritual would be influencing the kings. And I honestly think that's true today. I think that is absolutely true today. When you see, and there's there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about our government and what we're doing and what we're not saying. And it could be that other governments are, today. But obviously they're not going to talk about, since we've reached the subject, I'm going to go ahead and I'm bring up the theory here. So I'm going to drop a bombshell here of an idea.
I love it. Do it.
I was to go ahead and do it. But the idea is that if these demons are in the ancient world manifesting themselves through the gods in Mesopotamia and Egypt and Canaan through Baal and Asherah and others, how would you deceive a modern world? You would do it through technology, because what do we worship today? Well, people worship science. Most people who are not religious are going to worship science. So I really honestly think, and I did a podcast on this with Doug Potter, who, I don't know if you've had Dr. Potter we went to SES,
Yeah, I
and
have.
also Ken Samples, who co-authored the book with Hugh Ross on lights in the sky and little green men. We did a podcast on UFOs and UAPs and their connection to the ancient world. And so it could be, and again, I'm just going to suggest this, and I'm not super dogmatic about it, but I have a strong hunch that this is the case, that UFOs and UAPs are actually the way that the world is being deceived today by the same demons that were alive in the ancient world. I'm not the only one saying this. I want to be careful to not to get too far out in left field, but
Hey,
I
listen,
do
man,
think it's possible.
I'm absolutely fascinated with UFOs. I'm going to be honest with you, like especially like over the past 10 years, and it was like, hey, we're going to go ahead, like this crazy things happen in the world, so we're just going to slowly drop this little like unclassified thing about this UFO that some pilot saw and couldn't explain, and you're like, whoa, wait a second, that should be a bombshell, and then nobody ends up talking about it because some other major event in the world's happening. But I look at. You speak about UFOs. Have you ever heard of investigative reporter? Her name is Annie Jacobson.
Yes, I've heard the name. Yeah,
So
I think I may have watched a couple of things.
So I'm not saying like I agree with everything that she had to say, but I got on a kick a few years ago. I found some of her books because she wrote on like Area 51, the formation of the Pentagon, the formation of the CIA post World War II. She talked about Operation Paperclip. Which was, if somebody doesn't know what that is, it's essentially in the Cold War after World War II, we were fighting with the Russians on who could get the most Nazi scientists over to our culture to basically pay them off to give us technology so we could beat the other side. We wanted to beat the Russians wanted to beat us. And some people may know that's how we formed NASA, was based off a Nazi scientist. So she talks about, there's a bunch of different books that she has. I think she does a pretty good job of trying to interview people who were involved in the government, firsthand sources, doing FOIA requests and all that sort of other thing. But she talked about in her book, I remember, which I thought was, again, plausible and pretty interesting. Because if you think, the Nazis had some crazy technology. Technology was way beyond their time, and they just couldn't. You give them another decade, and they would have been breaking things open that you would have been like, I can't believe we're doing this. And they had it way back then in the 40s. And one of the things that she talked about was the Russians, they were working on these aircraft that were basically be able to fly without radar being able to detect them, which is pretty important, when you think about 50s, 60s time frame. And she was saying that some of the crash landings that happen of these, quote, UFOs, like, New Mexico, Arizona, and that sort of area, and they would discover the little green men, the non-human sort of people. She said, in fact, what is more plausible and what it seems like what was really happening is that these were mentally disabled or children with defects that the Russians were doing experiments on or practicing certain eugenics on, and then using them as the pilots for these aircrafts because they essentially knew it's a bit of a suicide mission, and that person is discardable anyways.
Wow.
And so I was like,
wow.
Just thinking about the nefarious sort of things that governments are a part of, including our government has been a part of, over the past 100 years or whatnot.
Absolutely.
But then a part of me is like, yeah, I get it that the government has technology now that 40 years from now, the rest of us will be like, oh, yeah, that seems normal. But now if we knew about it, we'd be like, oh, my gosh, how does that work? But at the same time, you look at some of these UFOs and you're like, it defies physics. Yeah. It's not just about technology. Like, that defies physics. Like, how is that thing doing that? And
Exactly.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's plausible that it could be something supernatural. I mean, why, a demon can manifest, or an angel can manifest itself in a certain way in the Bible. When you see that in a demon, they say Satan masquerades as an angel of light. And we don't
That's
know
right.
all the ins and outs about what demons and angels can do as far as like shape shifting or, you
Yeah.
know, manifesting themselves in certain ways. You even, I remember I did a big study. I didn't want to get too deep into it because I knew that this could be a little bit scary, but I got a big study into demonology and witchcraft and the occult. Okay. Walter Martin was like a big
Yeah.
influence on that, read his
Yep.
books on the occult
Great
and
scholar. Great scholar.
yep, on the cult and on, he had another book on the occult that he never finished before he died, but then his daughter
Hmm.
and I think his like publisher, or maybe his son and his publisher, something like that, they ended up
Yeah.
getting his notes together and finishing it. He had most of it done. And, he's telling stories in there of guys who used to be into the occult and then became Christians, and they're telling stories of things that you're like, well, that defies physics, like
Yep.
balls of light coming out, or like ooze,
Hmm.
blue ooze coming out of
Yeah.
the ceiling and forming into some sort of weird creature. So we have no idea the sort of things that these angels and demons can do. And I guess mostly we would say demons because they're trying to deceive. I
Yeah.
think it's plausible that it could be some sort of mixture of both, or
Yeah.
whatnot.
Yeah, and like you, Billy, I have also been following this. I mean, I was in the Air Force. I served in the U.S. Air Force. I was actually a survival instructor, and I also worked on F-15 Eagles, jet fighters. And so it interests me, and several of my friends are retired Air Force, and so I'm been following the military connection. And just recently, I think a few weeks ago, they had a congressional hearing in which they're you know, uh, trying to get transparency in the government. And there was one of the witnesses that came forward. It was an Air Force guy, and he was an image analyst. And he was recently on another podcast. I believe it was the Weaponized podcast with Jeremy Corbell. I don't know if you watched that or heard of that.
Mhm.
But he said something he just, when he said this, my ears perked up and I thought, that is fascinating. So at the end of the podcast, he's talking about things that he saw and knew. And, you mentioned some of the military, sightings of things that they can't explain. And, so at the end of the podcast, I think it's Jeremy Corbell asked him, um, well, what do you think it is? What do you think these things are? And he literally said, he said, well, I don't know if you're religious or whatever, but he said, we would call them in the ancient world, they may be called gods, demons, the spiritual, spirits, because he says they're not we don't have physical evidence of their existence, but we have other evidence. He says that's all I can say. And this guy, people can check him out. He's on the Weaponized podcast with Jeremy Corbell, and he's a pretty legitimate eyewitness, I think. But all of that is sort of anecdotal or circumstantial evidence to kind of reinforce the point that demons are very real, and they're not going to manifest in the modern world the way they are in the ancient world. We laugh the ancient world, go, these stupid people in the ancient world believing demons and angels, but they're very real. The Bible talks about them. In fact, I want to read what Deuteronomy says. God warns the Israelites in Deuteronomy, all the way back in the Torah. He warns them, when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. So God warned them. In fact, what's interesting about this, Billy, is that earlier I was talking about how the Israelites were in Mesopotamia and in Iraq. Get this. This is right before, of course, the New Testament. 600, get this, Jewish Aramaic incantation bowls in Babylonia There were about 1,500 years ago, and many of them have been researched and published. And about 3 times that of the ones that have been found there have been unpublished. These incantation bowls. These are a clay bowl with a spell inside the bowl. They're in Aramaic, but they're Jewish. They contain incantations designated for protection for an individual, or for medical cure, or for business prosperity, or some type of love charm, or curses, or whatever. And there's different theories about how incantation bowls were used. And we, of course, we'll have a picture of, people can see what I'm talking about. And I've read several things on this, and I've watched several lectures from scholars who this is their area of study. And what the scholars who study incantation bowls say is that there's a couple of different views of how they were used. The words, of course, are inside the bowl. And one belief is that, and it could be both. Sometimes it's multiple things, but one view is that you would put rice or some type of wheat flour inside the bowl and then throw it out, pour it out. And by the process of pouring out the rice, or not the rice, but the whatever offering it was, would start or energize the cure or the spell or whatever the case is. Another view says, and these incantation bowls were not just used by the Jews, they were also used by the Mesopotamians. And some of them actually had spells of protection against demons or evil spirits. And some people think they may have been used to turn them over on a table inside of a house to trap a demon, a lot like you would trap a spider in your house, so you don't like spiders, So there's a number of ways. So by the time Jesus came along in the New Testament, of course, this belief, they were professional Jewish exorcists. We read about this in the New Testament. They were, Jews that went around casting out demons. In fact, we find this in the book of Acts, and Paul talks about this. And there's one occasion in which, somebody tries to cast out a demon, and these demons attack that person, and they say, "We know Jesus and we know Paul, but who are you?" And so Jesus, of course, cast out demons. And there's one I want to mention, and of course, one very famous episode. It's the episode where Jesus is crossing over the Sea of Galilee, and he's up in the northern Galilee area. And of course, people know this episode very well. It's when Jesus cast out the man. As soon as he reached the other side, this man is living among the graves, and he's probably possessed. He is possessed with a demon, not just one demon, but many demons. And he's a madman. He has supernatural power. He breaks chains. He's hardly has any clothes on, or he's naked altogether. And so this guy's crazy. So as soon as Jesus gets out of the boat, he literally runs towards him and says, "Jesus of Nazareth, what are you going to have to do with me? Please don't torment me for my time." And then, of course, Jesus asks him his name. And he says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And then, of course, the demons beg Jesus to cast them into the herd of swine. And of course, they do this, and he does this, he allows this, and they go off into the cliff, and they are destroyed in the water, and they drown. Of course, the people hear about this, and they want Jesus to leave the area. I listened to a lecture on this.
He destroyed all their bacon. Of course, he wanted them to leave.
Of course, that's right.
A lot of bacon, Jesus, come on.
But a couple of interesting things about this, and the lecture that I listened to was by Dr. Craig Evans, who did a lecture on, I believe it was either ASOR, which stands for the American Schools of Oriental Research. It was either an ASOR talk or a Biblical Archaeology Society talk. And he gave a lecture on this episode. And an interesting little thing about this, that in the northern part in Galilee, where this area was, this is predominantly a Gentile area. In fact, what's even more interesting about this, and maybe the symbolism would not have been lost on the Jews, that, get this, Billy, we know from historical sources that the Romans actually had a garrison, a legion that was based in the Galilee. And you may or may not be aware that in Roman legions, they had a mascot, and that would be on their staff as they marched to war. And guess what the mascot of the 10th Roman legion was, Legio Fretensis, Legio X, or the 10th Roman Legion, which incidentally was the same legion that went in later and conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD. Their little mascot was, guess what? A boar's head.
That's crazy.
So when Jesus casts out the demons, he's puts them into the boars, and they're cast into the water and they're drowned. So it could possibly the Jews have thought this is Jesus. Not only is he driving out, in fact, the episode before that, Craig Evans talks about how Jesus is going to, is going to literally drive out and conquer the entire world with his message that Jesus Christ, that I think it's the episode where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain, and of course that is sort of a precursor to Christ coming and driving out the demons. And the driving out the demons is essentially he is the son of he's the son of David, but he's also Yeshua, the new Joshua, bringing Israel into the land and conquering their enemies. So a lot of interesting symbolism that's going on there. But the point is that Jesus, he is the king of all angels, and even the demons recognized him.
So I want to say a couple things. Number one, I think it was C.S. Lewis who talked about this logical fallacy called the fallacy of the calendar. And the idea was, maybe he called it something different, because there's two different fallacies. The one is like, just because you could date something doesn't mean
chronological snobbery.
Yeah, chronological snobbery. But yeah, the other idea is that very thing. It's like, because this is a new, this is the new modern way of thinking. We're much smarter than the ancient people. First of all, we're not, because you can't build the pyramids. The ancient, I guess the aliens built the pyramids, but
That's right.
The Egyptians built them, and we still can't figure it out. Or the sort of math that they were doing way back then without calculators, our people could never do today. But at the same time, it's like your own worldviews are self-contradictory, and you're looking at, people in the ancient world as if they were stupid. It's like you don't even believe that there is any sort of immaterial realm whatsoever, yet you believe that you have a consciousness, and you have the free will to believe.
That's right.
That there is no immaterial world. You have some other part of you that's not your physical brain, that's animating you and allowing you to have a will and pleasures and desires and feelings and all this other stuff. But your own worldview doesn't even allow that to happen. So that's a self-contradictory view. But yet you're going to look at the ancient world like they were stupid because they believed in ghosts. So, but then at the same time, you also hold a worldview that you're totally fine with Joe Blow down the street being a tarot card reader, and this person over here, reading crystal balls, and you think it's all well, man. It's like it's all good. That's your slice of pie. This is my slice of pie, and it's like, well, you can't have it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
So we sometimes look down on the ancient world as if they were dumb, they were rudimentary. They didn't have this sort of enlightened ideas that we have. But it's like, bro, have you ever gone on social media?
Exactly.
Have you seen the sort of stupidity of things that people believe and attest to and hold to?
Absolutely.
And not even social media, but you go to like some of the people who you would consider like, oh, these are leaders of society or whatever. And when they finally get kind of cornered and they have to give answers, you're like, that's a terrible worldview. That's not based on facts. That's not even based on modern science. I don't care, whatever. And we could go on a whole rabbit trail for that. But one thing I am interested in is, how they talk about, some people would argue, well, Jesus is accommodating himself, his teaching or the things he's doing, to the beliefs of the day. He's not affirming that they're true. He's just not going to challenge that. So he's going to work within that mental framework, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think he's doing any of that when it comes to demons, or do you think he's actually dealing with demonic entities all the time?
I think he's absolutely dealing with demonic entities. That's a great question, because it touches on something that, you were just talking about, actually, the whole idea about people, having these sort of anti-supernaturalistic biases. And in the New Testament period, it's pretty clear, and even in what's called Second Temple Judaism. So that's a time period leading up to the first century. and then going into the first century, in the Jewish world, in Israel, in the ancient Israelites, and not just the Israelites, but also the people who lived in and around those areas, they believed that illnesses and certain types of ailments were connected to demonic. And I don't think Jesus was necessarily, not saying that they were not actually, or in fact, when John the Baptist actually it was put in prison, and of course he has a question, it's like, well, he sends his men to Jesus' disciples, hey, are you really the guy? And so when Jesus tells his men, tell him that the dead, he sort of hints at that he's casting out demons. By doing these things, he's pushing out the demons and he's healing people. And I think that he's certainly dealing with supernatural things for sure, because obviously, there's never been a time that, except when he lived, that God in human flesh walked the earth. So obviously, fallen angels and demons and the demonic, they were there. In fact, they would, whenever he did have an interaction with them, the people who were demon possessed, they would, just come unglued and, shriek out because they knew who he was. And, how much, maybe some of the things that we deal with today, that's one of the things that Lewis, one of the things you were talking to a minute ago that might throw some light on this. One of the things that Lewis says in relationship to demons in the spiritual world is that when it comes to demons, we have two equal but opposite errors. One is that we think about them too much. We just give too much attention. You don't want to just completely focus on that all the time. But on the other side, we don't think about them at all. We just kind of block them out of our mind. So so perhaps some of the things that some of the issues of our day, some of the
I'll say it.
Psychological things. Yes, say it.
I'll say it. No, I was gonna tell you when you're talking about the man at Jenner set, running around the tombs naked and breaking chains. I'm like, bro, come do a ride along. I'll show you guys like that.
Yeah.
Wow. I've literally had to interact with people that, and I'm not saying that they were demon possessed, but I'm looking at them. I'm looking at what they're doing, and I'm saying that is the exact descriptions that the New Testament talks about of people who are demon possessed. And for anybody hearing this, listen, I don't discount mental health. I'm a huge proponent, about mental health stuff like that. Law enforcement, first responders. We talk about PTSD. I'm not against people using medications and stuff like that. My wife works in mental health in the medical field and stuff like that. So I'm not one of those guys that's like, you don't have depression, you just need to pray more. I'm not that guy. Okay.
Yeah.
But my wife and I have had extensive discussions about that, of that intertwining between, when you're treating somebody who has a legitimate mental illness, one of the Christian fault that could be, which happens sometimes, is you need more faith.
Yeah.
That's your problem. Like we were sitting in this church one time, and it's not a church we went to, but we were going there for a little while. We were in a transition period, and they had one of their, he was the Spanish minister there, because they had a big Spanish population within that area. So they had kind of their own church, and they were connected to that church. But anyway, so he's preaching, and he's talking about, he's boasting. He went to this lady who was depressed or whatnot. And he was boasting in his sermon how he essentially told her, get up. You don't have any real problems. You just need to pray more. Let's go. It's time to go to work for Jesus. And that was a boast for him. And I was grabbing my wife, don't go punch him in the face, sit back down. It's okay. Give a little grace here. But then on the other side, you get into the mental health world, you get into the psychological medical realm, and it's dominated by a worldview that completely rules out anything in the supernatural realm. So sometimes you are dealing with something that either is spiritual or it's a combination of spiritual and physical. And you're only treating the physical. You're not treating the spiritual aspect of it.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Whether it's a matter of sin and those sort of things in their life, or it also is a demon. And we talk about this in theology. You could have demon possession, but you could also have demon oppression. It's
That's
not
right.
necessarily that some demon is possessing you, but it could be
That's
that
right.
a demon's harassing you.
That's right. And people open themselves up. There's all kinds of. I mean, it's to use a term. It's a porous world culture that we live in, and they are in every little corner of our culture. And think with things that may seem innocent, like you know, uh, some kind of little séance you're going to go to with a friend, or some type of Eastern meditation that might open you up to the spiritual world, or some fantasy type stuff, or drugs for sure. I mean, we know of pharmaceuticals and drugs open the mind up. Hallucinogenics, people are doing mushrooms, that opens the world up to the supernatural. In fact, there's even people who are trying to communicate with aliens using seances and things like that. And to me, that's fascinating, and it also shows the connection that these things, there's a spiritual component to it, that people need to be aware of, that is extremely dangerous.
Does
That they
does
these are malevolent beings, that they don't have
Oh
your good
yeah.
interest in mind. Yeah.
Does Finkel talk about that in his book at all, about the ancient cultures like drug use, trying to connect with the dead spirits and
I
everything?
have not finished the book completely yet, but I've not come across that yet. No,
That'd be an
in Finkel's book. Yeah,
interesting
it would be
study.
fascinating. Yeah, it would be. Yeah,
Um.
but people did get drunk. I do know that.
Oh,
They
jeez.
drank they drank a lot of beer. In fact, beer is one of the oldest commodities in the world. Wine making goes all the way back to the Southern Caucasus and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and beer is in Mesopotamia, actually.
Nice. So
Yeah.
we've talked a lot about Mesopotamia. How do you think that their beliefs of the afterlife, their beliefs of these departed spirits or these roaming ghosts or whatever, how do you think that affected the Jewish belief when we get to that exile period where, well, I guess maybe even before then, but
Yeah.
it's just a carryover into, the Mesopotamian beliefs carrying over into the Babylonian, the Persian, and the Assyrians. And then, you get the Jewish people interacting with the
That's right.
Mesopotamians. And then later they go into exile into the Babylon and Persia and stuff like this. How
Yep.
or Babylon and Assyria, but how do those secular cultures and their belief of that thing, how does that affect the Jewish
Well,
belief?
yeah, that's a great question, and that's sort of what I was getting at earlier about how these when the Jews were in exile in these Mesopotamian city states. In first, it was in Assyria. We know that in around 722 BC, the Israelites were carried off. The northern kingdom was carried off first under a Syrian king by the name of Tiglath-Pileser III, and then later, of course, more were taken into Assyria. And then, of course, the Assyrians were conquered by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians were then eventually conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And there's a lot of crossover in Mesopotamia between their beliefs in the demonic, and so obviously the Jews are going to learn some of this stuff, and there's a heavy use of amulets and all types of protective type things to protect against demons. And I want to mention two in particular. They're connected to the Israelites, but in a sort of indirect way, but in an interesting way too. And we'll come back to another part of this. But let me just mention two demon names in Mesopotamia. One is pretty creepy, or they're both pretty creepy actually. Uh, but the first one is a demon in Mesopotamia that we see show up in Mesopotamian literature. We see because we have these spells we find in cuneiform tablets, and this demon's name is Lamashtu. Lamashtu, and this demon, Billy, was a vampire demon. Get this, that that went around and floated around at night in these Mesopotamian cities, and this is kind of creepy. It sniffed in the doorways for a newborn baby, and it would drink its blood in order for it to live. Now that's kind of creepy, and
Yeah, no
but
joke.
so scholars think though that this demon was invented by the Mesopotamians because they had to have some kind of reason, rational explanation slash rational, for crib deaths and stillbirths. We know that in the ancient world, and this is not controversial or anything, but very often humans, babies would not live. There's all kinds of reasons that babies die during the night or whatever, crib death. That happens even today, and then stillbirths. And so it's believed by many scholars that this demon Lamashtu would feed on these infants. So it was a really kind of scary demon. But there was another demon that was also scary, and he was really terrifying, but he could be used for good against the demon Lamashtu. And his name was a little more familiar to people. His name was Pazuzu. And Pazuzu, it's believed by the Mesopotamians, could push Lamashtu back to the underworld and protect the infants from this demon who would basically, take their life or take their breath.
Yeah, but what's the trade-off? What is Pazuzu or whatever his name is?
So
What is he doing?
Pazuzu was this really, and we'll have a picture of Pazuzu, was this sort of dog dragon face with wings and the claws of a dragon, and it was a little bronze amulet that would be worn as a necklace or hung in the doorway or the windows of the house to protect the person living in the house or the baby living in the house from this Lamashtu. But also, very interestingly, Billy, Pazuzu also, according to the Mesopotamian myths about Pazuzu, of course, all these demons and gods in Mesopotamia, they change and they sort of morph meanings, and they maintain their original significance, and then they sort of move around depending on what they're needed for. But eventually, Pazuzu sort of morphs into this god, get this, who protects against foul winds that bring the plague. And this amulet is found in Iraq. It was found near Nineveh, and found in Nineveh, of course, is the palace of multiple Assyrian kings in the 7th and 8th century BC. And we know, interestingly, there's an episode in the Old Testament where, of course, King Hezekiah engages in this siege warfare against the Assyrian king Sennacherib, and Sennacherib sends his troops in and destroys the city of Lachish. Archaeologically, we find evidence of this. It's extensive archaeological evidence of the destruction of Lachish by the Assyrian Sennacherib. And then eventually, of course, during the siege of Lachish, Hezekiah is preparing for the siege of Jerusalem. And in the archaeological record, is just amazing proof of this. He widens the wall, broadens the walls. We have archaeological evidence of this. He digs a water shaft under the city of Jerusalem to prepare for the siege of Jerusalem. And he prepares as much as he can for this onslaught of the Assyrian king. Now, here's where the archaeological, historical, and biblical record, there's sort of a little dark space, but we can sort of fill in the blanks here. So, according to the biblical record, the accounts are a little bit different, but they essentially match in the basic idea. At the end of the day, Sennacherib does not conquer Jerusalem. He absolutely does not. There's no archaeological evidence of that. We have extensive evidence of Jerusalem in the 8th century BC. There's no burn level. There's no, they are not taken. We do have burn levels in the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, but we don't have it during the Assyrian conquest. And the Bible says that there was a plague that spread throughout the Assyrian camp. Now, the Assyrian record, the Annals of Sennacherib says that King Hezekiah paid him tribute and he left. And we believe that certainly happened. But other scholars, Old Testament scholars, such as one in particular I'm thinking of right now, off the top of my head, is Dr. Eugene Merrill of Dallas Theological Seminary. He's got a great book called The Kingdom of Priests. And Dr. Merrill says that what likely happened is that Sennacherib was paid tribute by Hezekiah, gold from the temple, and he left. But then, to save face, he came back, because nobody's going to thwart, the Assyrian king. And it was when the Assyrian king came back that a plague swept through his camp. Now, why do I mention all that? Because it was very likely in the Assyrian camp, which, by the way, has also, we think, there's a scholar who worked in Jerusalem several years ago who tries to make the case, and I think he's right, that the Assyrian siege camp, when Sennacherib was in Israel besieging Jerusalem and Lachish, was discovered. It's not been excavated, but it's been surveyed. But I would bet possibly if there's any evidence of this, I'm not saying there will be, but likely in the Assyrian camp, they likely had a Pazuzu amulet hanging in their tent to protect them against the plague. But of course, it did not protect them against the plague. And I think that is I think a good case can be made for that, because in the Exodus, all of the plagues of the 10 plagues, all the plagues corresponded to one or more Egyptian gods. So this is a cosmic battle between Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, and the God of the Hebrews, or the God of the Assyrians, and the God of the Egyptians. And there's a great book on this by John Currid called Against the Gods. So this little Assyrian demon, Pazuzu, could not protect the Assyrian army from God's angel that basically took them out.
So, it's like, let's say you're a demon, and you're in your heyday, right? You have a name, you're Pazuzu, right? And you like got this great fear or whatever. And then all of a sudden that culture falls and you have to start morphing into something else. But now all of a sudden, like 700-800 years goes by. Like, you're a nobody now. Like, nobody really knows you. What are you doing? You trying to revamp? Are you gonna go off and retire in your little demon camp? Or are you gonna be like, no, I gotta revamp. I'm gonna go to South America. I'm gonna start haunting them.
They're just rebranding.
No, but seriously though, like I was thinking about that as we were coming up to our podcast. Is like, these guys they don't die. These demons don't die. So the ones that were manifesting, like you talked about, right? It's these ancient gods. I think a lot of them, there's demons behind it. Okay, they're in Babylon. Man, that's thousands of years ago. Like, what are they doing now?
Yeah.
Who are they?
Absolutely.
Who are they deceiving now? Because we know from the scriptures, like Ephesians 6, it talks about principalities and authorities and powers and all that sort of other stuff.
Yep.
And so there seems to be, and it would make sense, some sort of hierarchy within the demonic realm. Some sort of power. There's demons who are more powerful than other demons. And so it would make sense that this demon who's super powerful, he's not running around chasing your grandma, and trying to torment her. Like, he's going after world leaders.
That's right. That's exactly right. I will say, since we've talked about ghosts, and I want to mention this since I know we're going to wrap things up here in a minute. So let me just say this about ghost in particular, and not just in the ancient world, but I think also what we call ghosts today, and people today. And there's all kinds of I think there's even television shows and reality TV shows about this, where people go visit a quote unquote haunted house or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So this comes also true from the scripture, but also I think it applies equally across the ancient world and the modern world. That these are not ghosts; these are actually demons. These are not your dearly departed. The Bible is very clear that when a person dies, it is appointed once for a man to die, and after this, the judgment. So we see this in Luke chapter 16, where the rich man and Lazarus die, and they both go to Sheol. One goes to torment, and the other one goes to Abraham's bosom. So the Bible seems very, very clear from Genesis to Revelation that when a person dies, your soul, the eternal part of you, will go to either one place or the other. So that then kind of begs the question: well, what are these things? What are we seeing in these houses or with these places that seem to have these really strange phenomenon that appear? They seem to have there's some connection to the physical world. My contention is that these are actually demons. And to make your point that you were just making a second ago, I think that, in fact, Michael Heiser makes this point as well in one of his lectures, and some of his books makes this point, that it seems to be from Scripture that demons are connected to places, that they're, Jesus condemns them in the Sea of Galilee. And in the book of Revelation, there are demons that are chained in the Tigris and Euphrates are going to be released at the end of days. So it could it be that these demons that are haunted, they are low-ranking demons, they're still demons nonetheless, but as you said, the high-ranking demons are actually trying to move the world leaders. And in the ancient world, we see this with Alexander the Great. What does Alexander the Great do? When he gets into Egypt, he makes a point and he wants to go to visit the oracle. What is an oracle? An oracle is a woman or a man, typically a woman, who is induced in some type of drug-induced trance to give advice to kings and rulers. So what does Alexander the Great do? On his way to conquer Persia, he makes a detour down to Egypt. He goes into the Siwa Oasis, and he visits the oracle of the Siwa Oasis, who essentially tells him that he is a god. And then, of course, the most famous oracle in the ancient world, at least in the Greco-Roman world, is the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. And this oracle was a woman who would give advice to kings or anybody really, but she was very well known. In fact, the archaeological site of Delphi exists today. You could actually go to the place where that oracle existed. I have not been there, but I have been to one other place, and it was very creepy, I got to say. Several years ago, I was in Italy, and some friends of mine, and we went. Of course, I went to Pompeii, but the one place I went to that actually predates Pompeii, even it's the first Greek colony in Italy, and it's called a city called Cuma, spelled Cumae, Cuma, and there was an oracle or a sibyl, which is another way of saying oracle, the Sibylline oracle that was at Cuma. And she was located in a cave. You had to go into this long cave, and in the burial area of Cuma, and you can still go there today. So if you ever visit the city of Pompeii and you go to Naples, you got to visit Cuma. But we went, and we were actually with a church group, and they wanted me to say a few words, and I didn't. I knew a few things about oracles and things like that. So we actually, when we got into the place, there's actually a little place where the oracle would sit, and there was apparently a curtain in the area, and there would be candles and possibly some kind of hallucinogenic drugs or something like that, or maybe even some type of opioid or something like that. And the oracle would get high, basically, and a voice would come out, and you could ask it any question. So we know in the ancient world that there is extensive interaction with demons and rulers with these oracles, and from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece, even to Rome. You may remember, another famous one was, of course, another. She's called a haruspex. I think it's basically someone who reads internal organs in ancient Rome. And when Julius Caesar was on his way to the theater of Pompeii in Rome, she's basically said, "Beware." She's the one who said, "Beware the Ides of March." And one of the legends from Julius Caesar is when he passed her on that day, he said, "I'm still here," and she said, "The day's not over with yet." And then of course, when he went, he was stabbed by the senators in Rome. So there, in the ancient world, there is definitely a connection with the demonic and the supernatural with kings and rulers. And the question is today, how is that same connection with? Because that, as you said, Billy, they are real and they don't die. They're spirits, so they don't die. So how do they manifest today? And I think you can, they do it through indirectly and directly, through technology or through our infatuation with technology and that type of thing. People's infatuation with the cult. So it's not any one way. I think it's multiple ways.
Yeah, and I mean, again, if you're Satan, you think about it, like if you got somebody who wants to be spiritual, you're not trying to make them less spiritual. You're just going to misdirect it. You're like, yeah, let's take that desire for the spiritual and put it over here into the occult.
Exactly.
Let's put it over here into Eastern mysticism. Let's put it over here into this. As long as it's not the truth, as long as it ain't Jesus, Then that's
right.
fine. Go be spiritual over there. That's cool. Go, go to that, whatever that compound and go do your little incense and your prayers to nobody. Cause that's fine. You don't
That's
believe
right.
in Jesus.
I think that's exactly right, and it speaks of something even broader and more insidious, and that is that it's so permeates our society that we're not even used to it anymore. I don't think people realize, and I know this sounds like I'm being overly, like it's a demon in every corner, but I think with what we have seen, Billy, in our culture in the past several weeks and a couple of months, with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and that was terrible in and of itself, but the response of people, where does this level of hatred come from?
Well, so I put that out. I've been trying to revamp my podcast and we're doing like a comeback thing. And, I got all these ideas, and then that happened like right when, as I'm like trying to formulate one of those first episodes. And I looked at my buddy, I was like, yo, I'm not trying to capitalize on a guy's murder, but like we need to talk about this because the idea of my podcast is, we're gonna answer questions that churches are too scared to ask because I'm kind of really sick and tired of cowardly church leaders. That's really where my heart is, and I see too many sheep out there who are looking for answers, and their church leaders are either giving them vague garbage answers or telling them, good, nice Christians don't ask those questions. And I'm sorry, but that's not biblical, and you're a coward.
Amen.
So, anyways, not to get off on that rant, but I was talking to my friend, and I was just like, listen, like, let's take somebody on the other side, somebody that like I don't like, right? Like you can name plenty of them. I don't care. Just throw a name out there. Somebody who's super liberal or anti-Christian or whatever. I just think they're a deplorable person. They get taken out. I am not getting on the internet, nor am I going to feel in my heart rejoicing. Oh, I'm so happy that they died. I'm so happy this. And I had somebody trying to make a point, and they were like, well, in the scriptures, there's actually backing for rejoicing, when the enemy as a God falls. And I was like, no, not really. Like there is rejoicing in the Old Testament when you had physical kings who were trying to physically take out the physical nation of Israel when they would fall, because God, obviously wanted the physical nation of Israel to continue to keep his law so that way the Messiah could come and fill all the prophecies. But all throughout even the Old Testament, even God says that. He goes, I don't rejoice in the death of the wicked.
That's right.
Hey, don't be happy when Proverbs says, don't be happy when your enemy falls, or God's going to take, his wrath away from him. And then the New Testament, do we need to even talk about how the New Testament says that we should love our enemies, and pray for those who persecute us?
That's right.
Does that mean that we should be so happy when they die? No, absolutely not. Like, can I be alleviated that a persecutor of the church is gone from this world, and therefore that aspect of persecution is gone? Sure. But for that individual, well, that's a tragedy, because we know where they went. And so, it's like watching people rejoice at a human being killed on TV. I thought it was the sickest thing ever. And I even got to a point where, and I still think this, a few weeks later, I'm like, I think it should be illegal to post videos of people being shot on TV. Yeah. Like, what is the benefit of a society being able to have that, and where you inundate it, and then God forbid his kids in a few years get older and are able to go Google one of these millions of videos that are out there? It's sick, So,
agree.
Man, what a sick culture. And
it is
real evil, actual real evil in this world. And you tell me there's not a demonic aspect to it? You tell me demons aren't really influencing people, aren't really oppressing people and possessing people to go and do these sort of wicked things or have these sort of desires? It's like, oh, dude, these people are sick. So I definitely believe it's still active. And we can't have this sort of snobbery, because when I'm growing up, right, late night television, you had a lady on TV who you could call in and she would do the tarot cards. There's right up in the town next to me, there was this place that I passed all the time when we're going to like a Walmart, and it was like a lady you could go into, and she did her little palm readings and all this sort of other stuff. And I talked to Marsha Montenegro. Like, I've done a few podcasts with her, right? She used to be in the occult, and now she's a Christian. And the occult is still super active in America. So,
Very.
I mean, don't act
We
like
are. Our
we're not
culture is
spiritual.
obsessed with horror movies and evil. Some of the
Yes.
stuff that's coming out of Hollywood is just outright demonic to the
Well,
core,
the
and we're
horror movies,
we're entertained by it, and we're
yeah,
desensitized to it.
the horror movies when I was growing up, you get like Jason, right? You get a psychopath guy with a
Yeah,
mask and he's stabbing people. Nowadays, it's all demons.
yeah.
It's all the demonic
Possession,
realm,
possession. Yeah.
possession,
Uh-huh.
exorcisms,
Uh-huh.
insidious. That's
Yep.
that's everything it is nowadays. So
Yeah.
to act
And,
like we're
yep.
superior to the ancient world as if they believed in that sort of stuff. We're so enlightened. Come on, man.
Yeah.
You're gaslighting
Exactly.
me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's dangerous, and people need to be aware that it's real and it's not to be messed with because it's unclean spirits, and they hate you. They want to destroy you. I mean, the Bible says Satan is Lucifer is an angel of light, and he masquerades as an angel of light. So he comes in the guise of good or entertaining, but in the end is nothing but death. That's it.
Yep, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm sure. I know you said you haven't finished the book. It sounds like a fascinating book. I want to get it. I want to read it. Like I said, just the idea of the spiritual realm of ghosts, what people think about it, the
Yeah.
demons, how they manifest themselves, what the Jewish people believed, how that moved over into the New Testament, and even the development of the theological understanding. God revealing over time more and more of himself and the world that he created, the heavens he created. One of the verses that I thought about, and I wrote this down, I want to read it for anybody who's listening to this podcast. He's like, where do you go from here, right? Well, one of the things I want to say is this. Listen to what Paul says in 2 Timothy 1, 9 through 10. This is one of my favorite verses. I love this. He talks about God. He says, who has saved us. So God has saved us. He's called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was granted to us in Christ Jesus from all eternity. But now, this is what's cool, has been revealed by the appearing of our Savior Jesus Christ, who abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel.
Amen.
Now, I love that verse because he's like, look,
Love it.
all these ancient worlds, the ancient views of demons and spirits and incantations and what happens when you die and, like protection for the dead and protection for the living from the dead and all that stuff. He says, listen, Jesus, he's abolished death and he's brought life and immortality
right.
to light through the gospel. It's through the gospel, in the New Testament revelation that we see this is what death is, this is what life is, and here's the afterlife. And so, as you and I know, there is no name under heaven by which men should be saved except for Jesus Christ. So if anybody's listening to this podcast, if you're interested in ghosts, you're interested in the demonic realm and all this sort of other stuff, don't ever forget, like we were talking about, it is insidious. It's cool to study about. Don't get too infatuated with it. But the true thing you need to understand is there is a spiritual element, there is an afterlife, and that Jesus Christ is the only way to have eternal salvation because he brought it to light through the gospel.
That's right. And it's at the cross, Billy. It is at that brutal moment in history 2,000 years ago where Jesus was hung on the cross, and and C.S. Lewis and his Chronicles of Narnia series and the movie, people may remember the scene from the movie where Aslan is laying on the table and literally surrounded by all these creatures. And that's sort of the way it was from a metaphorical standpoint in Christ on the cross. He was literally surrounded by the demonic realm who, and these men who were literally, the Bible says that at that night, Judas was filled with Satan. He was filled with a demon, and he betrayed Christ. And of course, he was crucified. But on the third day, he rose from the dead. He conquered death, hell, and the grave. So all of the darkness, as you said, in the great passage that you just read, was all overcome by Christ. Christ brings victory over death, hell, and the grave, and he conquered death. And he is the King of life, and he will give life to whoever calls on his name. And another one of my favorite verses is, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world.
Amen. Amen. Any last thoughts, Ted, for us besides that about the book or about any of this stuff?
That's all I have for now. Yeah, I'm still working through it. I'm going to actually work on an article for Epic Archaeology. People can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and I think we're on Twitter X I don't know what you call it now,
Yeah.
but we don't. Not too active on Twitter at the time. I've just got so much on my plate right now. But we're definitely on Facebook and Instagram, so people can follow us there. But I am going to do an article, hopefully very soon, on what we talked about, some of the same themes, and there will be some images that people can see. So look for that coming soon.
Yep. And anybody who's listening to this, no matter where you're listening to it, just go to the description below. You'll see links to his Epic Archaeology and all of his social media platforms and websites and stuff like that. So thanks a lot, man. Appreciate you.